Hello and welcome to Lecture 3 on the Baroque Era. This lecture is going to be all about opera, but I want to just go back for a moment to the end of my previous lecture. In the last few minutes, I laid out for you all of the different genres of music which we will be looking at. And just to recap that, I said the way to organize them is to think of them first in terms of the instrumental genres over here and the vocal genres over here, which are really vocal with instruments. All three of these genres use instruments and voices together, which was the fashion as we move into the Baroque. The a cappella thing of the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, that's considered kind of old-fashioned. Audiences appreciate the drama and the excitement of having instruments and voices together. So, on the vocal and instrumental side were opera, oratorio, and cantata. We're going to focus today on opera. We're going to get around to those other two a little later on. On the instrumental side, I said the thing to do might be to organize them in terms of music for large groups of instruments, the orchestra, the Baroque orchestra, much smaller than the modern day orchestra, pretty much just the bowed stringed instruments plus keyboard. And then we have music for small groups of instruments, what we call chamber music, and we have music for solo instruments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about opera first today, and then in the following lectures I'm going to work through the list of those instrumental genres, and then I'm going to come back around to the vocal side and talk about oratorio and cantata, which are heavily influenced by opera. So many of the things that we will have learned in relation to opera will apply to oratorio and cantata. But let's start with opera, which I would argue is the most significant of all of these different genres. And if you may recall, I said that really the significance of the year 1600, if there is any significance in that year, being the first year of the Baroque, why that year? Well, partly just because it begins with 2 zeros, but also I think it is useful to remember that 1600 happens to be the year of the very first opera. Now, this opera was not preserved, it was lost. We know that it did exist because there are references to it. This opera was called Daphne, composed in 1600 by a sort of a team of composer poets, Peri and Caccini. So this is the very first opera, but it didn't survive. Peri and Caccini then collaborated on another opera shortly after that, which is the earliest opera to have survived, and the title of this opera is Eurydice. And shortly after that, another composer who is really the first great composer of opera, that is the first really first-rate composer to try his hand at opera, who was part of this same kind of group of artist musicians who were kind of had this conception of a new theatrical musical genre, opera. So he was kind of like there. He was one of the founding fathers of opera, we might say, although he didn't technically compose the first opera. He composed what is considered the first great opera, the first masterpiece of opera. And that is, of course, Claudio Monteverdi, the composer, and his first opera is Orfeo. So now, there are a couple of different approaches to talking about a subject as big as opera. And there are a couple of different ways you can do it. You could talk about what opera is, what are the elements of opera, but in that case you have to sort of generalize about the entire history of opera from 1600 up to the present day. There are still composers writing operas, so that's 400 years, and as you can imagine, a lot has changed over the years, and over that time there have been many different sort of genres of opera and subgenres, and there's a whole terminology, and there's a 400-year history there. And so some of the things that we might say about opera only apply to opera at certain times during that 400 years. Anyway, another approach we could take is to talk about the historical origins of opera, to tell the story from the beginning. about why it was created, and all of that. And I think what I'll do, since the book presents it beginning, by the way, at page 115, since the book presents first the elements of opera that are generally found in most opera, and then goes back to tell the story of how opera came about, and this is beginning around page 119, where it says opera in the Baroque era. I'm going to just present it in the same order that the book does, so that maybe you can follow along with the book and see some of the things I pick up on. Before I do that, though, notice that after the section that I covered basically in the last lecture about the basic elements of music in the Baroque era, there's a segment on music in Baroque society. I kind of covered some of that stuff in the first lecture, although I didn't go into the depth that the book does. You should definitely read that. Anyway, after that section, the book goes into talking about these different genres, like the concerto grosso and the fugue. I'm going to come back to those later because those are instrumental genres. And I think it makes sense to really start with opera, because opera is the most influential musical genre by far of the Baroque era. I think I mentioned in a previous lecture that we can compare it to like the big leagues, or we could compare it to, for example, the movies. When you think about it, if you wanted to be a star in the world of film or video or whatever, you would probably want to be a movie star, right? I mean, it would be good to be a TV star. It'd be good to be, I don't know, an anchor on the news or something. It'd be good to be, for some people, hey, if I can get an acting gig in commercials or in music videos, or maybe these days a YouTuber. There's so many different sort of film or video genres. But I think movies is still king, right? And the style of the movies influences so many other styles. The movie is like the leader in terms of style, and the other genres such as TV, commercials, music videos, or whatever, they tend to follow the trends that first appear in film, right? So what film is to these other related genres, opera is to the other genres of music in the Baroque. The trends that we see in so many of these genres that I'm going to talk about in the coming lectures, even purely instrumental genres, they often have their beginnings in opera. Okay, so having set all that out, let's talk about what opera is. First of all, the word itself simply means work. If you are operating something, you are working it, right? And the word opus from Latin is the root. It simply means work. In fact, we will get one of the things we'll talk about when we start talking about composers is they often use what are called opus numbers to list in which order a work of theirs was created or published. So opus 1 is the first published work of a composer, right? And just kind of tying in the word opus. I guess they just didn't know what to call this genre, so they called it work. It's a new art form that really was invented. It didn't really so much evolve from other things. It was a newly invented thing, and I'm not even really sure why or if the early inventors of opera called it opera. Or did they call it music drama or something else? And we just call it opera today. In any case, that's what opera means. It's a work. It's a musical theatrical work. The book defines it as drama that is sung to orchestral accompaniment. Okay, that's pretty broad, right? What about like Broadway musicals? Are they operas? Well, they're a type of musical theater, but most opera, this is an important distinction, most opera is sung from beginning to end, and that was certainly true in the Baroque era. As time goes on, there do develop other sub-genres of opera that do have spoken dialogue in them. In fact, there's one in particular. There's a German variant of opera called Singspiel, which means singing play. And Mozart wrote some Singspiel. And they have spoken dialogue and then musical numbers. But when people think of opera, they think of something that is sung from beginning to end. Right? And that presents some challenges, as you can imagine, as we'll talk about. And composers found ways to work with these challenges. Sung to orchestral accompaniment, this unique fusion of music, acting, poetry, dance, scenery, and costumes is a theatrical experience offering overwhelming excitement and emotion. It really is, going back to our definition of Baroque, right? Which means, it means a misshapen pearl, the original meaning of the word, but it refers to something that is exaggerated, over the top, maybe even a little bit grotesque or overdone somehow. And opera, it seems to me, is definitely the most theatrical, the most over the top of all the musical genres, right? So opera usually begins, and I'm just kind of moving down halfway through page 116. Opera begins with a book, right, with the text, which is then set to music. And that text in the early days of opera was usually based on some kind of Greek or Roman or some kind of myth or story from antiquity. So this appreciation for all things Greek and Roman, which begins in the late medieval and the Renaissance, which characterizes this new attitude of humanism that we learned about in the Renaissance. This carries on through the Baroque era, and that's really what the inspiration for opera is ancient Greek drama. Again, it's hard to talk about it without jumping back and forth, from the elements of opera to the historical origins. But opera begins with a text, which is called the libretto. It simply means the little book. Libra in Italian means book. So if you go to a library, right, there's a similar, if you know French, livre is the French word for book. So in the Romance languages, it's going to be something that sounds kind of like that. So the libretto is the little book, and the person who writes the libretto, who writes the text that the composer then sets to music, is the librettist. And as is often the case, remember I said this is true in the Renaissance, and it's true in the Baroque with almost all opera. The composer writes the music, but does not write the words. A librettist, who is a professional writer, a poet, writes the words. And again, it's not usually the case that he's just making up a story out of the blue. He is basing it on, in the early days, Greek and Roman myth or stories from the ancient world. The librettist and the composer sometimes collaborate and actually work together. But sometimes the librettist is not really in the picture as the opera is being created, that is, as the music is being written. The composer will, select a libretto that has already been written, and there were poets who specialized just in writing librettos. Just like, in the movies, there are writers who just write screenplays and hope that someone will pick up their screenplays at some movie studio, some producer will decide to make a movie based on their story, on their screenplay. Same kind of thing in opera. So by the time the composer decides on a libretto and decides to make an opera out of it, the librettist might even have died or, might not be in the picture at all. But sometimes there are examples, there are famous examples actually of collaboration, teamwork between a given composer and a librettist. But that doesn't have to be the case. Now, the book goes through some of the different genres of opera. There are many, many different subgenres, but I would say there's sort of like two broad categories, as there are in drama generally. There's comedy and tragedy. Now, comedy and tragedy don't necessarily mean exactly what you might think they mean. So comedy doesn't mean necessarily that it's like laugh out loud funny. It's not necessarily humorous. That's not really what comedy means. It can be humorous, and there are times when in a comedy, whether it's a play or whether it's an opera, there are moments of humor. But essentially, a comedy is a type of drama where there's basically a happy ending. And very often that happy ending takes the form of a wedding, like if there, or even a double wedding, if there are, characters within the story, and there's usually some kind of love story, right? In almost any opera, just like in any drama, in the movies, there's at least some kind of romantic interest going on, right? And in a comedy, very often at the end, whatever circumstances, whatever challenges, whatever plot twists and turns happen along the way, in the end, there's a happy ending, and there's sort of a life-affirming ending, as the main characters often get married. Right? Tragedy, on the other hand, usually ends with one or more of the main characters dying. Tragedy is considered more serious, and comedy is a little bit more lighthearted. Again, I'm speaking in kind of gross generalizations because there are many different subcategories. And then there are even some operas that have elements of both comedy and tragedy at the same time. Don Giovanni by Mozart is an excellent example of this. We'll look at that in the next unit. So many different subgenres of opera, as you can imagine, over the course of a 400-year history of this art form. Also, there are, as the book states at page 117, remember we talked about the different voice types in our lectures in the elements of music. So we have these different voice ranges, right? Soprano, alto, tenor, bass. We have some in-between voice ranges. Mezzo-soprano, which is in between soprano and alto, and baritone, which is in between tenor and bass. Well, within opera, there are even more specific categorizations of voice types that don't necessarily refer just to the range, but to the character of the voice. Like, is it a huge, overwhelming, powerful voice that a certain singer has? Or is it does it have a sweeter tone, but maybe a smaller sound, right? There, as you can imagine, there are many, many, many different voice types. And here are some of them, some of the main voice types listed on page 117. So a coloratura soprano has a very high voice range, and this is kind of like the type of voice range where the composer will very often write a melody that sort of shows off that voice range, where there are many difficult, tricky passages way up in the high register. Right? If you've ever heard, you can Google it, or maybe I'll include a link to it, the aria sung by the Queen of the Night from The Magic Flute by Mozart. There's this very famous aria, which is a song within an opera, that's just ridiculously high and difficult to sing. That's the kind of thing that would be sung by a coloratura soprano. A lyric soprano has a light voice and sings roles calling for grace and charm. So it's not like showing off. It's more charm and just and beauty of voice. Right? A dramatic soprano is a big voice, a powerful voice, capable of passionate intensity. And then we have various types of male voices. The lyric tenor, sort of like the male equivalent of the lyric soprano. The dramatic tenor, equivalent of the dramatic soprano. Basso buffo. Buffo means basically clownish, like a buffoon. And so this is something you might find a comic role, very often in a comic opera, where it's a low voice, or sort of like a character sometimes that is like the butt of jokes, or a clownish type of character who has a low voice. But a basso profundo is a profound or a deep bass. And usually this is a serious type of bass voice, where it may be some very, very noble, dignified character will have a very low voice. It sort of like signifies his gravitas or whatever, right? So now, you don't necessarily need to memorize all those different voice types and exactly which is which. Just be aware that within opera, there are roles that are specifically written for certain voice types. And you might be a soprano, you might be a great soprano, but if you are more of a dramatic soprano, you are not going to be singing roles that are designed for a lyric soprano or a coloratura soprano. Very often the composers of these operas had certain singers in mind, people that they knew, that they wrote for, like, she would really be great. I'm going to write an opera with such and such singer in mind, and it's going to be fantastic. And this singer will love it because it'll show off her ability, and I will love it because nobody could sing this particular aria, this song that I have in mind, better than this person. I'm going to write it specifically for that type of voice. So it gets very, very specific in terms of voice types. And those voice types are associated with certain character types within the story. Anyway, moving on. There are two basic types of solo song within an opera. So an opera is usually broken up into different songs. Although it's sung throughout, there are different types of quote-unquote songs. I mean, we don't really call them songs. We call them arias or recitatives or choruses or duets or whatever. But they are instances of singing with instrumental accompaniment. And they serve different purposes. The first one the book mentions is the aria. And the word aria, it's related to an English word that is not used so much anymore, an English word for a song, which is an air. Some of you might have heard of this title of this piece by J.S. Bach, Air on the G string, the G string being the lowest string on the violin. And it's the title air in that instance means simply a song. So it's an old-fashioned word for song in the English language, but the Italian equivalent of that is an aria. So what kind of a song is it? Well, it's a straightforward song with a beautiful melody, with very often with sort of verses and choruses, not so different from a popular song. But there's another type of singing in opera, which is in some ways more important, although it's usually less musically satisfying. It's more important in terms of the evolution of opera itself, and I'll refer back to it when I talk about the evolution of opera in a few minutes, and that is recitative. Recitative, and you can, if you see it written out, R-E-C-I-T-A-T-I-V-E. It looks like recitative in the English language if you were to pronounce it as an English speaker, but in Italian pronunciation, it's recitative. And it is recited singing. It's speech-like singing. It's somewhere between speaking and singing. And recitative, as a style of singing, was invented right along with opera itself. And the idea of recitative is we want to make sure that the words are understood. In recitative, the words are of primary importance, whereas in aria, it's really more the tune, the melody, the music, which is of greater importance. And they serve different functions within an opera, and they're very often paired together. So you might have a recitative followed by an aria, followed by another recitative, followed by another aria, sung by different characters. The purpose of the recitative, where the words are most important, is to basically move the plot along, to give the audience information that they need in order to follow along with the story, right? And this is often easier to do in the form of spoken dialogue rather than singing, right? So let's say that the plot of my opera, let's say I'm writing an opera, and there's some sort of love triangle story, okay, where there's two guys, there's Jim and there's Bob, and they're both in love with Emily, okay, and Emily really loves Bob and not Jim, and Jim and Bob hate each other, whatever you can imagine. I'm just coming up with stuff off the top of my head. But in order to get all of this plot information across, it might be easier, we might be able to get that stuff out there and also make sure that it's clearly understood by singing it in sort of a speech-like way with minimal orchestral accompaniment. Like the orchestra will maybe just play a chord, and whoever is kind of giving this exposition of the story to us on stage will be able to sing a lot of words very clearly in a short period of time to give us the gist of the story. Remember, opera is sung from beginning to end, so we don't really have like a voiceover. We don't have the thing like at the beginning of Star Wars where it tells you, the words receding into space, giving you the plot outline. We have to get that information out somehow, and it's often easier to do it via recitative, right? So let's say over the course of my opera, I don't know, Jim and Bob end up fighting a duel because they both are in love with Emily or whatever, and unfortunately, Bob is slain. Jim kills Bob, runs him through with his sword. How are we going to get that communicated out to the audience? I mean, I guess we could show it. We could actually have the sword fight on stage. That might be exciting. But it might make too much time. It might be difficult to work into a musical context. That kind of thing has been done in opera. But let's say we wanted to get the benefit of that information out to the audience without actually showing the sword fight. We might have a servant run into the room where Emily is sitting before her mirror, brushing her hair, getting ready for her big date with Bob. Well, this servant or this maid or a lady-in-waiting might run in and say, "Oh, Emily, I have such terrible news. Jim and Bob get into a fight and Jim killed Bob," So that information might be presented to us in recitative. It will be sung, but it'll be sung in a speech-like way, and the composer will actually try and match the natural inflections of the way you might say that kind of thing, might sort of translate it into musical pitches and rhythms. And that way it's, again, sort of half between speaking and singing. That's recitative. Now, let's say that happens in the course of my opera. Emily has just heard the terrible news that her beloved Bob has been killed by Jim, who she's not even that crazy about. Well, now Emily might sing an aria lamenting her poor lost beloved Bob and how she loved Bob, and Bob was her whole world, and she was so looking forward to spending her life with Bob, but now she's never going to see Bob again. So she's basically reflecting. She's expressing her emotions to us through song based on the information that was conveyed in that recitative. And we don't really need for the words to be as absolutely clear in the aria by Emily, because we can feel the emotion through the music, right? I mean, there are going to be words in there, but the aria, the purpose of the aria is more to express emotions, which can be done through the melody, through musical means, and therefore the words are a little less important. I mean, we can imagine the kind of words that Emily might sing, but it's the music that's really going to affect us, not the words. With recitative, the music is less important. What's more important is the words, because there is plot information that must be somehow transmitted to the audience. So that's, in a nutshell, the relationship between recitative and aria. Also within an opera, we often have various kinds of ensembles, that is, instances where more than one person is singing. So almost all operas have some kind of like a lover's duet, right? So imagine earlier in the opera, this imaginary opera of mine, maybe at some point Bob and Emily sing a duet about how much they love each other. And this will be an aria, most likely. It won't be a recitative, right? So it'll be a beautiful melody, and maybe they will each have a verse, and they will sing to each other, and then they will sing in harmony and come to a big finish, and it'll be very moving and touching, right? Now, maybe as they are singing, as the two of them are singing on one side of the stage and looking into each other's eyes and singing to each other, maybe on the other side of the stage, Jim comes creeping on and he joins in the song. Now, we kind of have to suspend our disbelief a second. In such an instance, maybe Bob and Emily don't even realize that Jim is over there on the other side of the stage. Jim is watching them, and he's so jealous, and he's singing now about, oh, I'm going to get that Jim. Emily is mine. She will always be mine. I can't let Bob have her. You know. I don't know if I got my names mixed up there, but you get the idea. So what started out as a duet might turn into a trio. But even though two people in the duet might be oblivious that the other third person, I mean, we can see all three of them, but these two might not be aware of that one. These kinds of, we have to, again, suspend our disbelief when we are watching opera. It's not necessarily meant to be realistic, right? It's Baroque. It's exaggerated. It's not like real life. Exactly. Okay, so we have various kinds of ensembles. Duets, trios, even sometimes quartets or quintets, whatever. And then we also have the chorus. Almost every opera has a chorus, just like in Broadway musicals, there's a chorus. The chorus, the idea of the chorus actually goes back way before opera. You find in Greek tragedy. And all those ancient Greek dramas, I don't know if you've read any of them in one of your literature classes, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus. In those ancient Greek dramas, there was always a chorus. And the role of the chorus might be made up of like the townspeople or the soldiers or whatever. It's the people in the background, sort of like the extras. And sometimes they will get together and sing, and very often what they're doing is like having observed the action between the main characters, like having observed the duel between Bob and Jim, and having observed poor Emily being so distressed at the murder of Bob by Jim or whatever, they will comment on what is taking place and try to make sense of it all and say, I wonder what this means for us. What will happen next? In a way, the chorus is sort of like a stand-in for the audience. They aren't really participating in the action. They are there kind of observing it in a sense the same way we, the audience, are. So some other terms that they mention. Now, important to remember, opera, certainly in the old days before such things as microphones and amplifiers and speakers, opera is never amplified. It's purely acoustic. It's purely unplugged, right? And so that means that an opera singer has to be able to sing without amplification, and their voice has to carry over sometimes a pretty big orchestra, especially at a loud climactic point where the orchestra might be playing full blast. These opera singers have trained themselves so that really their body is their amplification system, right? And it's uncanny when you hear someone, in a big concert hall or a big opera house, and you're in the back row, and there's this very small figure way down there on stage, and they are absolutely filling the concert hall with sound, with nothing other than their God-given voice. And not only that, but a typical opera might be 3 or 4 hours long, and it has to be memorized all the way through. All the actions, all of the words that you're singing, all the notes, etc. Okay, it's a tremendous undertaking to learn an opera role for an opera singer. And very often, these singers have to have several roles memorized in their head at any given time because, maybe they get a phone call from their manager because so-and-so famous opera star is sick. Singers get sick all the time. You can't sing if you're sick, even a little bit sick. And so you get a call from your manager like, can you fly out to New York and sing at the Met tomorrow night? We're doing Don Giovanni and we need someone to, and that's the kind of thing that could make your career or could break your career if you don't have that role already memorized. So, professional opera singers have several different roles memorized at any given time because they're doing multiple performances, or they might have to be an understudy. That is someone, a big opera production, they have understudies. So they have their lead roles, but if one of them gets sick or something happens, they got to have people that can stand in a minute. So I mention all that because they bring up the prompter in here. A prompter is somebody who is in a little compartment that you can't see from the audience, right? Let's say like cross section. Here's the stage, right? Down here below the stage is the orchestra pit. The orchestra of an opera, they play in this little pit that's below the stage because you're not supposed to see them really. I mean, you can see them a little bit, but they're not up on stage because they need to be sort of hidden away because we want to be focused on the action on stage. So the orchestra is down here in the pit. The conductor is standing here where he can see and direct the singers and also direct the orchestra. So the orchestra members can't see at all what's happening on stage. Only the conductor can see both what's going on stage and what's going on with the orchestra down in the pit. But then there's also a guy in a compartment below the stage that has a little window, basically, that looks out facing the stage, where the singers up here on stage can see down to where the prompter is. Basically, there's like a little window at basically, just big enough for the prompter's head to be sticking up looking at the singers. The prompter is there in case one of the singers forgets the words, right? Because, I mean, no matter how good your memory is, there's a chance over the course of a 4-hour opera that you might forget some of your words. And so the prompter is in this compartment, this hidden compartment that the singers can see, but the audience can't see. And he is following along with the score. He's got the music and the words in front of him. And he's actually mouthing the words in an exaggerated way and looking at the singers in case any of them get lost. The singers can kind of glance down at the prompter and see him mouthing the words to them, and hopefully it will jar their memory. So they've thought of everything. Okay, next thing they mention is the overture or the prelude to an opera. It's really usually called the overture, not the prelude. The overture is a piece of purely instrumental music at the beginning of an opera that is played by the pit orchestra before the curtain rises. And it has the function of sort of setting the mood, but it also has a practical function, which is it's sort of like the opening music in the movies. Well, nowadays, actually, that function that I'm about to talk about is usually put by the coming attractions. Let's say, if you had an opera and it started right off the bat with the actual opera from the beginning, what about people who walk in late, right? They're going to be finding their seats and getting in people's way, and you're not going to be able to see. It's going to be an annoyance. And so there is a purely practical side to this. The average opera overture takes about between 10 and 12 minutes, maybe. Sometimes some of them are even a little longer than that. So the curtain is closed. You walk in, you get your seat if you arrived on time, all right? And the curtain is closed. The orchestra, you can see a little bit of them, maybe the tops of their heads, down there in the pit, and they're warming up, they're tuning up. And then you see maybe just, again, the top of the head of the conductor walk out into the pit, and people will clap, and the conductor will like hoist himself up above the pit so he can take a little bow, and then he will get back down, and he will call the orchestra to attention and begin the overture. And the overture will last for whatever, 10, 15 minutes. And during the overture, if there are latecomers, they can take their seats without interrupting any of the actual opera itself. When the overture is over, the curtain rises and you have the first aria or the first recitative or whatever. The opera proper begins then. Now, I believe that it is common practice now in big opera houses that even if you are late but not so late that just the overture is playing, they're not going to let you in. I think that is the case at the Met. It may be different at other, different opera houses have different practices, but opera fans are really kind of fanatic about their opera, and they do not tolerate people coming in late, cell phones going off, people talking. You will get dirty looks. You will be shushed and hissed at if you do any of that. Okay, so that's the overture. Now, it says, just concluding this section on elements of opera, many of the best loved operas are in Italian, German, French, or Russian. This is true, but as we will learn in just a couple minutes, opera was invented in Italy. And for a very long time, Italian was considered really the only proper language for opera, right? And all opera composers, whatever nationality they were, for a very long time, and even if they wrote some operas in other languages, let's say in their own native language, if they were French or if they were German or whatever, for a very long time, they all wrote operas in Italian because that was like the proper language for opera. There are also some practical benefits to writing in Italian, which is that like 50% of the words in Italian rhyme with the other 50%. It's such a perfect language for setting to music, because the way that you have, for example, vowels followed by consonants followed by vowels. Take a word like panini. You've got a consonant, a vowel, a consonant sound, a vowel, another consonant, another vowel, and it's and you can think of lots of other words that rhyme with panini, linguini. So Italian just lends itself so well to setting to music. But fairly soon after the invention of opera in Italy, there are composers in France writing operas in French. Sometime after that, we begin to see some German opera. And in the late 18th century into the 19th century, we see the beginnings of opera in Russian. And as we move into the 19th century, into the age of nationalism, where very often composers will express their sort of patriotic or nationalistic feelings through their music. Then we have, for example, Polish composers creating operas in the Polish language, and Czech composers writing operas in the Czech language, and so on, right? So nowadays you can have an opera in any language, but I would say probably of all opera ever composed, probably 75% of it is in Italian, right? That's just a guess off the top of my head, but okay. So now, having talked about most of the elements, I believe, of opera, let's talk about how opera came to be in the first place, how it evolved, how it was invented. It says here, opera was born in Italy, top of page 119. Its way was prepared by musical discussions among a small group of nobles, poets, and composers who began to meet regularly in Florence around 1575. This group was known as the Camerata, which they say is Italian for fellowship or society, and included the composer Vincenzo Galilei, father of the astronomer Galileo. Well, the word camerata, it sort of means fellowship or society, but what it literally means is chamber, which means a room. A chamber is a room. So it's a camerata could be a bunch of people who meet together in a room, like the chamber of commerce of a town. It's not literally the room that the chamber meets in, but that's where it gets its origins from. And there was a particular room in Florence where the members of the Camerata met, and this was the home of Count Bardi. So Count Bardi was a nobleman, he was a count, and like many members of the nobility during the Renaissance, and this would be late Renaissance, right? This is 1575 they're talking about, when the beginnings of opera, when this group, the Camerata, was kind of like coming up with this new art form. Count Bardi was interested, like so many people during that time, he was interested in all things Greek and Roman. He was a humanist, right? And interested in the arts. And he was friends with a bunch of poets, a bunch of composers, including Vincenzo Galilei, and maybe more importantly, a singer-composer named Jacopo Peri. Right? Now, these guys, they somehow came up with the idea that, what would be great is if we could come up with basically a new reinvention of the greatest art form of all time, what they believed to be the greatest art form of all time, which was ancient Greek drama. These guys knew the dramas of Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and they said, you know, we should have something like that today, but in Italian, of course, so that people can understand it, not in Greek. And moreover, they believed, now I don't think scholars necessarily believe this today, but it was believed back then that those ancient Greek dramas were sung throughout, from beginning to end. They weren't just spoken. Now you can find them in the library and you can read them today, and they make excellent reading, and you could see productions of them where there's no singing, where people just speak their lines. But these people, the members of the Camerata, believed that those ancient Greek dramas, the scholarship of the day suggested that they were sung, and that they were sung in a specific way that was something between speech and singing, right? So these people coming up with this idea for this new art form, this basically a revival of Greek drama, but for modern times and in Italian, they said, well, we should do the same thing. We should have it sung from beginning to end, but much of it will have to be sung in a speech-like way so that the words are clearly understood, because to them, the words, the drama, was the most important part, not really necessarily the music, right? For the inventors of opera and the early opera composers, like, for example, Claudia Monteverdi, who they start to talk about on the next page, they believe that in an opera, the music existed to serve the words and to heighten the meaning of the words, and the words were of primary importance. And this begins sort of a controversy that goes on throughout the history of opera. There are some composers who believe that the words and the drama and what's taking place on stage is the most important thing, and that the music is less important. And then there are other composers who say that's nonsense. That's not what the audience goes to hear an opera for. They're there for the music. They want to hear fantastic singers with all of these different voice types, with these athletic voices doing amazing things. And they want to hear beautiful melodies that tear their heart out and make them cry or whatever. They don't care about the plot. They don't care about the story, right? So there's sort of a long-running debate, and different composers, different theorists, whatever, having different ideas about which is really more important, the words or the music. Well, for the members of the Camerata and the early opera composers like Monteverdi, it was really the words, because if you didn't understand the words, you were not going to get the point of the drama, right? You were not going to feel the emotions that you were supposed to feel, etc. So this group, the Camerata, wanted to create a new vocal style modeled on the music of ancient Greek tragedy. No actual dramatic music had come down to them from the Greeks, so they based their theories on literary accounts that had survived. In other words, descriptions from the time of how these plays were put on. And that's what led them to believe that these dramas had been sung throughout. And that's what led them, in turn, to create the recitative style. And what also is what caused the sort of rejection of polyphonic texture. Remember, one of the big things that changes as we go from the Renaissance to the early Baroque is the idea that the polyphonic texture, which was prevalent in the Renaissance, that's old-fashioned. It doesn't serve our purposes now with the creation of this new art form, because if we have different melodic lines all going on at the same time, the words aren't going to be able to be understood, right? So we have to simplify the texture. We have to have just one person singing at a time, and that melody should be sort of speech-like so we can understand the words, and the accompaniment should be very much in the background. It should not overshadow the singer. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why polyphonic texture goes away in the early Baroque era, although eventually it comes back again, right? One of the trends of the Baroque is that the music becomes increasingly polyphonic. And even within opera, right, a duet or a trio with different people singing different melodic lines and sometimes different words at the same time is polyphonic. But again, That's something that happens later in the development of opera. The idea of the early opera composers is you should pretty much just have one person singing at a time. Now, the earliest opera that has survived is by Jacopo Peri, who was a singer. I mean, he was a composer as well, but he was primarily a singer. He was known as basically the greatest singer in Europe at the time. And he was part of this group, the Camerata. And he wrote the earliest opera that has been preserved. And this opera was performed, in 1600. So maybe that earlier opera that I mentioned, that's, I think, maybe 2 years earlier, 1598. The earliest opera that has survived to the present day was first performed in 1600 at what was then the wedding of the century, the wedding of King Henry IV of France to Marie de Medici, of the Medici family, who were sort of the ruling family of Florence. Right? Remember, the Camerata, they are in Florence, right? This group of intellectual humanists. The Medici were a family of bankers, and they're fabulously wealthy, and their daughter is marrying the King of France. And so there was weeks of wedding festivities, and part of the entertainment for the very illustrious guests at this wedding was the very first opera. This opera, Eurydice, is based on the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus and Eurydice, the story in brief is Orpheus is sort of a half god, actually. I believe he's the son of Apollo, but I think his mother is a mortal woman. Anyway, Apollo being the god of music, by the way, Orpheus is the most supremely gifted musician in the world. He is so amazingly talented that when he sings his songs and plays his Greek harp, the very trees and rocks begin to dance and move around. Okay, so he has like supernatural musical powers. Orpheus is in love with Eurydice. They are happily in love with each other. They plan to marry, but unfortunately, Eurydice is bitten by a snake. She dies and descends. Her soul goes down into the underworld, Hades. Actually, Hades is the ruler of the underworld. He's a god. He's like a brother of Zeus. Orpheus is just heartbroken. He decides, he says, look, I know that whoever goes into Hades, no one has ever come out of there. But I'm going to go in there, and I have a plan. I'm going to go into Hades. I'm going to bring my harp with me, and I'm going to go into the underworld. I'm going to find Hades, the Lord of the dead, and I am going to sing to him of my love for Eurydice, and I'm going to plead with him to let me bring Eurydice back, right? Because after all, I'm the world's most gifted musician. I have these like godlike musical powers. If I can make the rocks and trees dance around as I play my harp and sing, surely I can melt the heart of Hades, and he will relent, and he will let Eurydice leave and be the first person to leave the underworld and come back with me into the world of the living. Or, if not, if it doesn't work out, then I'll stay there in the underworld with my beloved Eurydice, right? Now, as the story goes, in the Greek myth, and I believe, there's a painting describing this exact scene on page 121. Orpheus goes into the underworld, he finds Hades, he pleads to Hades, he sings his love songs about how much he loves Eurydice, and Hades, the Lord of the dead, is actually moved, and he says, you got me. Tell you what I'm going to do, Orpheus. I'm going to let you kids go, right? But on your way out, you, Orpheus, are going to go first. And Eurydice, you're going to follow behind, right? And you just walk out that way. However, Orpheus, you may not turn around and look to make sure that Eurydice is following you. You have to take it on faith. After all, I'm a god, Hades, and I give you my word. So if you can walk out of here and not be tempted to turn around and make sure that she's following you, you can leave. Sounds like an easy challenge, right? Well, wouldn't you know, Orpheus screws it up, and you can see this moment is depicted in this painting. Now, of course, Orpheus and Eurydice are dressed like, late 16th century Italians. rather than ancient Greeks, but you can see they are just emerging from this cave, and Eurydice is pointing like, we're almost there, and Orpheus is trying to sneak a quick peek back. He just can't help himself. He loves her so much, he can't help but look back and make sure that she's still there. And at the moment that he does that, you can see this sort of demon grabbing Eurydice and pulling her back. Now, this is tragedy. It's a sad ending. Maybe not the best ending for entertainment at a wedding, after all. Seems like kind of a downer to the story because, there's no happy ending. What Perry actually did is he changed the ending to make it a happy ending. He made it so that they did make it out of the underworld and into the world of the living. And when you think about it, this is sort of like a perfect kind of musical drama entertainment for a wedding, because it's about music, right? Music, there's a reason for the story to be musical, because Orpheus is himself a musician. So we don't find it strange or odd that people start singing and whatnot, right? And also, it's about love, right? It's a love story, and if you change the ending a little bit, it's a happy love story, right? So it's perfectly appropriate for wedding entertainment. Now, that's the earliest surviving opera, Eurydice, 1600, by Jacopo Peri. Peri was a great singer, no doubt, the greatest singer of his time, perhaps. He was sort of a second-rate composer. There was a first-rate composer, Claudio Monteverdi, who saw a production of a later production of Eurydice by Peri, and he thought he could do better with the same material, with the same story. He thought, that's pretty good, but I think I can do better. And also Monteverdi had been in touch, although he was not really a member of the Camerata. He had corresponded back and forth, but he was very aware of what they were doing, right? He was writing recitatives himself. He was writing madrigals, which had a solo melodic line and instrumental accompaniment instead of like polyphonic. Madrigals of the late Renaissance style. So Monteverdi decided, I'm going to create my own version of this same story. And this is what he did. And this is considered the first great opera. And the title is Orfeo. Orfeo is simply the Italianized version of the name Orpheus, right? So Monteverdi used the name of the male lead character, Orpheus, instead of Eurydice. But it's the same story, right? So there is quite a bit in the book about Monteverdi and about Orfeo, and there's a listening example of the recitative Tu sei morta. So very, very briefly about Monteverdi, greatest composer of his time being the late Renaissance. He was born 1567, into the early Baroque. He died in 1643. So he's got sort of like one foot in each era. He lived during this transition from Renaissance to Baroque, and he was one of the founders of the Baroque style, really. He was the trendsetter of what became the trends of the Baroque. And again, the first great opera composer, although he composed lots of other different types of music besides opera. They mention in the book that Monteverdi was appointed music director at St. Mark's in Venice, the most important church position in Italy. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't being the composer to the Pope in Rome, in the Sistine Chapel, like Palestrina, wouldn't that be the most important music director at a church type position in Italy? Well, maybe, but maybe not. In terms of which job you would want to have, you would definitely prefer to work in Venice if you were a composer. And the reason is, Venice was an independent republic, first of all, a powerful independent republic. It had its own little empire, right? And it was independent in many ways. In terms of religious practice, in some ways, it was fairly independent. One big important way that matters for music is people in Venice liked to hear instrumental music even in church, right? Now remember, the church, the authorities in Rome, they don't like the idea of playing instruments in church. But the Venetians love it. And so, the church in Venice says, well, this is what we like to do. Too bad if you don't like it, Rome, And so if you were the composer at St. Mark's, which is still there to this day, if you Google a picture of Venice, I guarantee they're going to show St. Mark's, this magnificent, huge church, which has multiple galleries or lofts where you can put groups of instruments or maybe separate choirs, and you can create sort of like stereo effects of different instrumental groups or choir groups kind of playing off each other. There are actually multiple organs within St. Mark's. And not only that, but you get to be in Venice, which was sort of like one of the leading musical centers all throughout the Baroque. I would say the single most important city in terms of music in the Baroque was Venice. So to have that job was the most coveted job, really, of any musical position at the time, sacred or secular, because you could also compose instrumental music and have it performed in church, So Monteverdi composed all kinds of music, sacred and secular, right? He composed, I believe, about 20 operas, all right? So he is the first great opera composer. So read about him. Listen to this recitative, Tu sei morta. I'm just going to talk a little bit. We're not going to have time to listen to the thing. I'm already over time a little bit. But in the listening guide, you will see all of these examples of text painting, of expressing the words musically, which are outlined in the left column of the listening guide, right? So you'll have the same thing in your ebook. The exact time when something happens, what's going on in the music, the text in the original Italian, and a translation of the text in English. So this is the moment when Orpheus realizes that Eurydice is dead. He says, Tu sei morta, you are dead, you are dead. Yet I breathe. You have left me, and I remain. And he says, no, he resolves himself, no, if my verses have any power, if I have this musical power, which I know that I have, then I will go confidently into the deepest abysses, into the underworld. And having melted the heart of the King of Shadows, I will bring you back to me to see the stars again. Or, if pitiless fate denies me this, I will remain with you in the company of death. Farewell, earth, farewell, sky and sun, farewell. So those are the words. And notice how, for example, on the word abyss, abyssi, there's a very low note. On the word stelle, the stars, I will bring you back with me to see the stars again, high note. On the word morta, a low note. On the word sun, at the sort of the peak of the last phrase, a high note again. Listen to that, and next time we will start to talk about, we'll talk probably about Henry Purcell and his opera in the English language, Dido and Aeneas, and then we'll move on from there. See you then.